It was a Tuesday night, around 11, when I walked into our living room and saw the vase. This vase wasn't anything special, just an ugly ceramic thing Rachel's mom had given us years ago. We kept it tucked on a high shelf in the dining room, out of sight, mostly forgotten. But here it was, on the living room floor, lying in pieces. At first, I thought one of the kids must have knocked it over and decided not to tell me. But then I noticed something else. There was a small, scuffed heel print, faint but unmistakable, in the fine layer of dust the vase had left on the floor. It didn't look like it was from Rachel's shoes, though. Hers were all neatly arranged by the door. I felt a chill run up my spine, but I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just tired. I picked up the pieces of the vase, tossed them in the trash, and went to bed. 2 days later, I came home early from work to grab a document I'd left in my study. Rachel was supposed to be working late, but when I pulled up in the driveway, her car was there, along with another one, a silver sedan I didn't recognize. I remember standing there, just staring at that car for a moment, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled. I didn't know what to expect, but I walked in quietly, feeling my heart thud with every step. The house was silent, almost eerily so, but the faint sound of whispers came from upstairs. Standing there at the foot of the stairs, I felt rooted to the spot. The faint murmur of voices drifted down from the bedroom, but I couldn't make out a single word. What I could hear, though, was a familiar laugh, the kind Rachel used to let out with me when we first met. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus, and started up the stairs. I moved slowly, trying to make sense of it all before I saw what was waiting for me at the top. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios as I reached the landing. I'd never been the suspicious type. In fact, Rachel had even teased me once, saying I was trusting to a fault. But this wasn't normal, was it? Rachel wasn't supposed to be home, and as far as I knew, we didn't have any friends or family visiting. I heard a deep, muffled voice reply to her laugh, a voice I definitely didn't recognize. That laugh echoed in my ears as I made my way down the hallway, heading straight for our bedroom. With every step, my stomach churned, a sickening tension building inside me, and yet, I still held on to a faint, irrational hope that maybe I was wrong. I reached the door and stood there, listening to my own shallow breathing. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer, so I pushed open the door and stepped inside. And there they were, Rachel, and a guy I'd never seen before in my life. They were both standing by the window, facing each other, not even noticing me at first. He was around my height, but stockier, with a smug grin plastered on his face. Rachel's back was to me, and I could see her hand on his arm, like they were in some private moment that had nothing to do with me. It was like a switch flipped in my mind, and all the tension I'd been holding in suddenly vanished, replaced by a kind of cold detachment. "So, who's your friend, Rachel?" I asked, my voice sounding too calm, even to me. They both jumped, Rachel's hand falling away from him as she turned to face me, her eyes wide with shock and something else, maybe fear, or maybe just guilt. She stammered something about him being an old friend from college, but I wasn't buying it. Her face told me everything I needed to know, even before she could get a full sentence out. She couldn't meet my gaze, her eyes darting anywhere but at me, like I was some stranger who'd walked in on her private life. The guy, though, didn't seem fazed. He glanced at me, then back at Rachel, and shrugged as if this whole situation was just mildly inconvenient for him. I felt a flash of anger rising in my chest, but I kept it in check, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't let them see just how deeply this was getting to me, not yet. "Old friend, huh?" I said, crossing my arms as I looked between the two of them. "Seems like a cozy reunion for old time's sake. Mind telling me why you're here while Rachel's supposed to be working late?" Rachel's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for an explanation, but no words came out. The guy just smirked, like he found the whole thing amusing, and that smug look on his face pushed me closer to the edge. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. He finally spoke, his tone casual, almost mocking. "Hey, man, I don't know what you're getting so worked up about. We're just catching up." "Catching up?" I shot back, barely able to keep my voice steady. "In my house? Alone in our bedroom? Don't insult my intelligence." Rachel finally found her voice, stepping forward and trying to place a hand on my arm. Michael, it's not what it looks like, she said, her tone pleading. I can explain, just give me a chance to explain. I took a step back, refusing to let her touch me. The sight of her reaching out made my skin crawl. Explain what, exactly? I demanded, keeping my eyes locked on her. Explain why I'm coming home early to find you alone with some guy in our bedroom? Go on, Rachel, I'd love to hear this one. She hesitated, glancing over at him like she was hoping he'd step in and back her up, but he didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching the whole thing like it was a show he'd tuned in to watch for his own entertainment. Rachel finally looked back at me, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of defiance and desperation. Michael, you're jumping to conclusions. You're not even listening to me. If you just give me a chance. A chance? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. A chance to what? To lie to my face again? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of real regret. But before I could even process it, she squared her shoulders, as if trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. Look, Michael, I know this looks bad, but it's not what you think. This is Josh. We went to college together, and he's in town for a few days. We were just catching up. That's all. Catching up in our bedroom, I repeated, my voice laced with sarcasm. Funny, I don't remember us being so casual about entertaining guests in private. I felt the anger rising again, this time barely under my control. If this is what catching up looks like to you, then maybe I should start inviting my friends over for a little catching up myself. The guy, Josh, apparently chuckled under his breath, and that was the final straw. I took a step toward him, and he held up his hands defensively, like he wasn't about to let me get the upper hand. Whoa, easy there, man, he said, his tone still infuriatingly calm. I think you're blowing this way out of proportion. I felt my hands clench into fists, and it took every ounce of self-control I had not to swing at him right then and there. Out of proportion? You show up unannounced in my house, alone with my wife, and I'm supposed to just accept your little reunion without a second thought? Josh's expression turned serious for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced between Rachel and me. Look, I get that this looks bad, he said slowly, his tone almost condescending, but I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just here to see an old friend, that's all. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should talk it out with your wife instead of getting in my face. Before I could respond, Rachel stepped between us, her hands raised as if to defuse the situation. Michael, please, can we just sit down and talk this through, she begged, her voice trembling. It's not what you think. I swear. I stared at her, barely recognizing the woman in front of me. I felt like I'd been blindsided, and every instinct I had screamed at me not to trust a word she was saying. But despite everything, a part of me wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt one last time. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step back and unclench my fists. Fine, I said, my voice cold and steady. Let's talk. But Josh here doesn't need to stick around for that, does he? Rachel hesitated, glancing at Josh with a look I couldn't quite read. But he shrugged, shooting me one last smirk before he headed for the door. As he passed me, he leaned in just close enough for only me to hear. Good luck, man, he murmured, his tone dripping with condescension. And with that, he was gone, leaving Rachel and me alone in the silence that felt heavier than any words could. I turned to face her, waiting for her to start, to give me the explanation she seemed so desperate to offer. But all she did was stare at the floor, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. It was like she couldn't bring herself to look me in the eye. Finally, she whispered, Michael, please just listen. I crossed my arms, watching her carefully. I'm listening, Rachel. But you better make this good. Rachel finally looked up, and for a split second, she met my gaze. Her eyes were red, but I wasn't sure if it was from guilt or embarrassment. She started to open her mouth, closed it, and then seemed to collect herself, taking a deep breath. Michael, she began, her voice low and shaky, I know this is hard to understand. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. She bit her lip, glancing away. I didn't want you to find out at all, to be honest. She may as well have slapped me across the face. Find out what, exactly? I asked, my voice calm but cold. That you've been sneaking around with some guy in our home, in our bedroom? She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted around the room, as though she was looking for an escape. I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. She had to know she'd crossed a line. A huge one. And now there was no coming back. You don't understand, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then explain it to me, Rachel, I shot back. Enlighten me. Because right now, all I'm seeing is my wife lying to my face and trying to cover up a mistake she didn't even care to hide properly. My anger was rising, and I struggled to keep it in check. I couldn't let her twist this. She took a deep breath and held up her hands like she was trying to calm me down. Michael, please, you're making this out to be something it's not. I'm not. I didn't mean for things to happen like this. You have to believe me. Believe you? I could feel the disgust building up in my stomach. How can I believe a single word you're saying when everything coming out of your mouth is one excuse after another? Rachel's face tightened, and for a second, she looked like she wanted to say something back, to defend herself. But she caught herself, took another breath, and tried again. Michael, I've been going through a lot. Things you wouldn't understand. Josh, he was there for me. I clenched my fists, fighting to keep myself from shouting. There for you? When was he there for you, exactly, Rachel? When I was working late to make sure our bills were paid? When I was taking the kids to practice in games and helping them with homework while you were going through a lot? Stop it, she snapped, a flash of anger in her eyes. Don't act like I'm the only one responsible for this. It's not just me, you know. A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. Really? You're trying to make this my fault now? You're the one sneaking around with another guy, and you're blaming me? Rachel crossed her arms defensively, her jaw tight. I didn't say that. But you're acting like you're some kind of perfect husband, like you haven't been emotionally absent for months now. Emotionally absent? I could barely believe what I was hearing. Rachel, I've been here, every day, taking care of you, of our kids, of this house. Everything. And you're telling me that wasn't enough? She turned her face away, and I could see her clenching her jaw, trying to hold back whatever was going through her mind. But she didn't respond. For a moment, we both stood there, the silence between us heavy. It was as if she knew there was nothing she could say that would justify what she'd done, yet she was determined to deflect the blame. I shook my head, feeling the anger turn into something colder, something I didn't even recognize. You know, I thought I knew who you were. I thought I could trust you. But clearly, I was wrong. Rachel's face softened, and she looked down at the floor. Michael, I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Things got complicated. Josh was there for me in a way that I didn't think you could be. In what way? I demanded. What exactly did he give you that I didn't? She looked away, and I could tell she didn't have an answer. Or maybe she did, but it was an answer she wasn't willing to admit out loud. The silence stretched between us, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, she muttered, "It wasn't like that, Michael. I know how it looks, but it wasn't as serious as you're making it out to be." I scoffed, feeling a surge of rage bubble up again. So you're saying I shouldn't be upset that my wife has been sneaking around with another man in our own house? Her eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly, almost angrily. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't plan it, okay? I didn't want this to happen. I don't know, things changed. I felt lost, and Josh was he was there. Lost? I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. You felt lost, so instead of talking to me about it, you went and found someone else to confide in? You know, that's what a marriage is supposed to be for, Rachel. You're supposed to turn to your partner, not go running to the first guy who's willing to listen. She flinched, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of shame cross her face. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by that same defensive look. I don't expect you to understand, Michael. You've never understood. Then make me understand, I said, my voice barely under control. Tell me why. Tell me what was so wrong with our life, with our marriage, that you felt the need to go behind my back. She bit her lip, looking like she was struggling to find the right words. It's just, you weren't there, Michael. I mean, you were physically there, but you were distant. Like you didn't even care. I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around what she was saying. So because I was working, because I was trying to keep our lives together, you felt justified in betraying me? I didn't mean to betray you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It happened. That's not good enough, Rachel, I snapped. You don't get to say it just happened and expect everything to be okay. You made a choice, and that choice has consequences. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. Michael, please, you have to understand. I never wanted to hurt you. I needed something that I couldn't get from you. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. Something you couldn't get from me? I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. And what exactly was that, Rachel? What was so important that you had to go behind my back to get it? She hesitated, and I could see her struggling to find the words. But whatever she wanted to say, she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. The silence stretched between us, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, she looked down, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know why I did it. I felt trapped, like I couldn't breathe. And he was a way out. A way out? I repeated, feeling a fresh surge of anger. You think sneaking around with another man is a way out? A way out of what, exactly? She didn't answer, and I could see the shame in her eyes, the guilt that she was trying so hard to hide. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I got them. You've got some nerve, Rachel, I said, my voice cold and unforgiving. After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you, you repay me by going behind my back with some guy you barely know? It's not like that, she protested, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, Michael. You have to believe me. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Believe you? Why should I believe anything you say? You've been lying to me for who knows how long, and now you're asking me to trust you? She looked down, her face pale and drawn, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She knew she'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Whatever she'd been trying to protect, whatever excuse she'd been clinging to, it was gone now, shattered by her own actions. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. So, what now, Rachel? I asked, my voice cold and steady. What are we supposed to do now? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at me, as if she didn't have a single answer to give. And in that moment, I realized that whatever I thought I knew about her, about our life together, it was all a lie. And there was no going back from that. After our confrontation, something in me shifted. I couldn't see Rachel in the same way, couldn't look at her without that anger boiling up again. It was clear there was no apology she could offer that would fix this. She had shattered something I didn't even know was breakable. I'd always thought our relationship, our family, was rock solid, built on a foundation that couldn't be broken. But here we were. I barely slept that night. I lay awake in bed while Rachel stayed in the guest room, probably tossing and turning herself. Every few hours, I'd hear her get up, the floor creaking under her footsteps as she moved through the house. But I didn't care. She was out of my sight, and that's all that mattered. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to talk to her. I just needed to figure out what to do next. I got up early the next morning, making sure to avoid her. As I drank my coffee, I noticed her things scattered around the house, the photos of us together on the shelf, her scarf draped over the arm of the couch, her favorite coffee mug on the counter. Everything in this house felt tainted now. I wanted to erase every trace of her. Maybe it was irrational, but I didn't care. She didn't deserve to be comfortable in the life we'd built together, not after what she'd done. My mind started spinning with ways to make her feel even an ounce of the betrayal and humiliation I was feeling. This was about more than just confronting her, it was about making her pay. I knew Rachel thought I'd just wallow in my anger and let it fizzle out over time, that maybe we'd go to counseling or some nonsense like that. But I wasn't interested in therapy or forgiveness. I wanted her to hurt, and I wanted her to know it was coming from me. The first thing I did was make a call to our family lawyer. I wasn't about to get blindsided if she decided to take things into her own hands. The lawyer gave me a lot of options, some of which I hadn't considered. I could file for divorce and push for full custody, considering her recent behavior. We both knew she'd try to spin it like I was the irrational one, but the fact remained that she had put our family at risk with her actions. Over the next few days, I gathered every scrap of information I could find. I kept my distance from Rachel, acting indifferent and busying myself with errands and work, but every chance I got, I combed through her emails, her phone bills, and anything else I could get my hands on. I wanted to see if there were more lies hidden in there. Every night, I'd go through everything, piece by piece. There wasn't much, just some texts, a few call logs with numbers that I didn't recognize but later traced back to Josh. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I wanted everything I could get to make sure I had leverage. Then it hit me, Josh's job. She'd said they'd been catching up, that he was in town, but I hadn't really thought to ask if he even lived nearby. I remembered her saying something about him living a couple of hours away, and suddenly, I felt like I'd stumbled on something. If he'd been coming over here regularly, sneaking around under my nose, maybe even taking off work for this, it could cost him. So I decided to pay him a visit. Using the address I found through some digging, I drove out to the building where Josh worked. The receptionist looked me up and down as I walked in, probably wondering what a guy like me was doing in her office. "Hi, I'm here to see Josh," I told her, plastering on a friendly smile. I told her it was a personal matter, and that was enough to get her to dial him up and send him down. Josh showed up in the lobby 10 minutes later. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed, but he tried to play it cool. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, trying to keep his tone light, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He probably thought I'd come here to beat him up or something, but I had other plans. "Just thought I'd pay you a little visit," I said, my tone casual. "I wanted to see the guy who's been spending time with my wife." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. "Look, man, I don't think this is the time or place." "Oh, I think it's perfect," I interrupted, lowering my voice. "I'm sure your colleagues would love to hear what kind of guy you are." His face paled slightly. I took a step closer, keeping my tone low but threatening. "I know about you and Rachel, and I'm sure your boss wouldn't appreciate the fact that you're spending work hours sneaking around with another man's wife." Josh looked down, clenching his fists, clearly nervous. I could see the wheels turning in his head, but he didn't say a word. "If I find out you've been anywhere near her again," I continued, "I'm going to make sure everyone here knows exactly who you are." I could see the panic flash across his face as he realized I wasn't bluffing. He muttered something about being done with Rachel, that it was a mistake, but I didn't care. I'd made my point. I left him standing there, pale and speechless, and went back to the car, feeling a grim satisfaction. This was just the beginning. The next part of my plan involved making Rachel's life just as uncomfortable as she'd made mine. I didn't say anything outright, but I made subtle changes around the house. I moved her things out of our bedroom, stacking her clothes in the hallway closet and taking her personal stuff out of the bathroom. I wasn't going to play nice or pretend like everything was okay. When she came home that night and saw her things piled outside the bedroom, she knew exactly what it meant. She looked at me, her eyes red and pleading, but I turned my back on her and went to bed alone. For the next week, I made sure she knew she was no longer welcome in my life. I stopped responding to her messages, stopped asking her about anything that wasn't directly related to the kids. I went about my day, ignoring her, making sure she understood that she'd been demoted to a guest in her own home. She tried to break through, begging me to talk, saying she'd explain everything, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. The truth was, there was nothing she could say to make up for what she'd done. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Then came the day I decided to lay my cards on the table. I waited until she was sitting alone in the living room, scrolling through her phone. I dropped a folder on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up, confused, and reached for it. As she opened it, her face went pale. Inside were the screenshots, the call logs, the texts, all the proof I'd collected of her little reunion with Josh. "Michael, I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "Don't bother. This isn't a negotiation, Rachel. I'm done. We're done." She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "You can stay here for the sake of the kids, but I want you to understand that we are over. You're free to do whatever you want, but don't expect any sympathy from me. Not after what you've done." She looked at me, her face pale and stricken. "Michael, please, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to lose you. I was confused." "Confused?" I laughed bitterly. "You were confused about whether or not to throw away everything we built together? I think you made your choice pretty clear." She wiped at her eyes, looking defeated. "What do you want me to do?" I leaned in close, my voice cold and unyielding. "I want you to live with the consequences. I want you to understand that you chose this, and now you have to live with it." Over the next few days, I made her life as uncomfortable as I could. I knew she'd try to play the victim, to twist things in her favor, but I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I started making plans for the future, talking to my lawyer about what it would take to get full custody of the kids. I wasn't about to let someone who'd betrayed me have any more control over my life than absolutely necessary. But the hardest part was seeing the kids every day, knowing that they'd have to live with the fallout of Rachel's actions. I did my best to shield them from it, to make sure they didn't see the tension between us, but I knew they sensed something was wrong. It broke my heart to think about the family we could have had, the life we could have shared if Rachel had only been honest with me. Yet as painful as it was, there was a part of me that felt relieved. I'd been living in a lie, trapped in a marriage that wasn't what I thought it was. And now, for the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life again. I was done being the victim. I was done letting Rachel walk all over me. From this point forward, I was going to take care of myself and my kids, and Rachel was just going to have to deal with it. The days after our confrontation were tense, to say the least. The house was quiet, save for the kids' laughter and chatter. Rachel and I were barely speaking, only exchanging a few clipped words here and there when absolutely necessary. She tried a few times to approach me, to start a conversation, but I shut her down every time. I didn't know her anything, least of all a chance to smooth things over with some weak explanation. Then one evening, I came home from work, and she was waiting for me in the living room. Her face looked pale and drawn, and she had dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. I ignored her and started to head upstairs, but she stepped in front of me, blocking my way. "Michael," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to talk." "I don't see what there is to talk about," I replied, trying to step around her, but she moved to block me again. "Please, just give me a few minutes," she pleaded, her eyes searching mine for any trace of compassion. I stared at her, feeling a surge of anger, but also a strange kind of resignation. Maybe it was time to hear her out, to let her say whatever she needed to say so we could finally put an end to this nightmare. I gestured toward the couch. "Fine. Let's get this over with." She sat down, her hands twisting together in her lap, while I sat across from her, keeping a safe distance. For a moment, she just looked at me, like she was searching for the right words, but all she seemed to find was silence. "I know I've messed up," she began, her voice shaking. "I know there's nothing I can say to make this better, but I want you to understand what happened." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my expression impassive. "Go on," I said, crossing my arms as I waited for her to continue. She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands as she spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, Michael. When I ran into Josh, it was like I don't know, like I was seeing a part of myself I hadn't seen in years. I know that sounds stupid, but I felt like I'd lost myself somewhere along the way. I didn't say anything, just kept watching her, waiting to see where this was going. After we had the kids, everything changed, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I became a mother, a wife, but somewhere in there, I stopped being me. Josh, he reminded me of who I used to be, of the person I was before all of this. Before all of this, I repeated, my tone cold. You mean before you had a family? Before you had responsibilities? She flinched, but didn't look up. It's not that I don't love you, or that I don't love our family. It's just, I felt like I was suffocating, like I was trapped in a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. So you decided to go and relive your college years with some guy you barely know? That's your idea of finding yourself? She shook her head, finally looking up at me, her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't like that, Michael. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. But it doesn't mean I don't love you. Love me? I laughed bitterly. Rachel, if you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to my face every day while you snuck around with him. Don't stand there and tell me you love me. Love doesn't look like this. She looked down, wiping at her eyes. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I'm asking for it anyway, because I don't want to lose you. Her words hung in the air, but they meant nothing to me. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the fear, but I didn't feel any sympathy. She was the one who had brought this on herself, and now she had to live with the consequences. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Rachel, what exactly are you asking for here? She swallowed, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm asking for another chance. I want to fix this. I want to make things right between us, for the kids, for us. Make things right? I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. How exactly do you plan to do that? You can't undo what you've done. You can't erase the fact that you went behind my back and betrayed me. That doesn't just go away. She looked down, biting her lip, her hands trembling. I know it's not something that can just go away, but we can work on it. We can go to counseling, or whatever it takes. I'll do anything, Michael. Just, don't throw this all away. I stared at her, feeling a cold rage bubbling up inside me. Throw it all away? You already did that, Rachel. The second you brought him into our lives, into our home, you threw everything away. I didn't do that, you did. She looked away, her face pale, and I could see the guilt written all over her. But I wasn't interested in her guilt. I wanted her to understand just how deeply she'd betrayed me, to feel the full weight of what she'd done. I want you to understand something, I said, my voice cold and steady. This isn't just about you and me. You've destroyed our family, Rachel. You've shattered the trust that held everything together. And there's no fixing that. Not with counseling, not with apologies, and certainly not with empty promises. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked like she was going to break down. But she held herself together, nodding slowly, as if she finally understood. So, what now? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. Now, we move forward. Separately. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. No, Michael, please. Don't do this. Think of the kids. They need us, both of us, together. I felt a pang of guilt at the mention of the kids, but I pushed it aside. The kids deserve better than this, Rachel. They deserve better than to live in a house full of lies and betrayal. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, refusing to let her touch me. Please, Michael. Don't give up on us. Don't throw everything away because of one mistake. One mistake? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Is that what you're calling it now? A mistake? This wasn't a mistake, Rachel. This was a choice. You chose to lie to me, to betray me, to bring another man into our lives. And now you want me to just pretend it never happened? She looked down, her face pale, and I could see the shame written all over her. But I wasn't interested in her shame. I was done with her excuses, her lies, her attempts to manipulate me into forgiving her. I'm not pretending, Rachel, I said, my voice firm. I'm done. I'm not interested in fixing this, in trying to patch things up. I want out. Her face crumpled, and she looked like she was about to break down completely. Michael, please don't do this. I can't lose you. I can't lose our family. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly smothered by my anger. You should have thought about that before you decided to throw it all away. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, stopping her. Enough, Rachel. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I don't want to hear any more lies. This is over. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if finally accepting that this was real, that there was no going back. Fine, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. If that's what you want. It's what I need, I replied, my voice firm. I can't live like this, Rachel. I can't live with the knowledge that the person I trusted most in the world was capable of doing something like this. She looked down, her hands twisting together in her lap. I'm sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us looking at the other, lost in our own thoughts. Finally, I stood up, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me, but also a strange sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the endless cycle of trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. I was done. I looked down at Rachel one last time, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger. I'll stay in the guest room until we can figure out the details. For the kids. She nodded, her face pale and drawn, and I could see the regret in her eyes. But I didn't feel any sympathy. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting alone in the silence. Over the next few days, Rachel and I stayed out of each other's way as much as possible. I moved into the guest room, kept conversations to a minimum, and threw myself into the routines with the kids. They hadn't yet grasped what was happening, thankfully, and I was determined to keep their lives as stable as possible. Rachel, meanwhile, looked like a shadow of herself, like someone who'd woken up and realized too late just how much she'd ruined. She went about the house quietly, mostly staying in our room, and when she did come out, her eyes were red-rimmed, and her face looked tired, haunted almost. I didn't waste time thinking about how she was feeling, I was focused on making my exit as smooth as possible. I met with my lawyer the following Monday, and we went over everything I'd need to start the divorce proceedings. It wasn't a long meeting, and it was refreshingly straightforward. I wanted a fair split and to ensure I had ample time with the kids. Rachel hadn't shown any signs of fighting me on this front, but I knew it could get messy once papers were served, so I wasn't taking any chances. After the meeting, I came home to find Rachel sitting in the kitchen, staring out the window with a vacant expression on her face. She looked up as I came in, her mouth opening slightly as if she wanted to say something, but she closed it again, deciding against it. I felt a pang of bitterness at the sight. All these years together, and this was what it came down to, two people who once shared everything, now unable to even look each other in the eye. That night, after the kids were asleep, she came to the guest room door. I had left it slightly ajar, so I could hear if the kids needed anything, and she tapped on it lightly before pushing it open. I looked up from the book I was pretending to read, my face impassive as she stepped in and closed the door behind her. Michael, she began, her voice trembling, we need to talk about how this is going to work. With the kids. And everything else. I put the book down, nodding. All right, let's talk. She pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down, her hands wringing together as she spoke. I know I don't deserve anything from you after what I did, she began, her voice choked. But I want you to know that I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure the kids' lives aren't affected by this. I couldn't hold back a scoff. You're a bit late for that, don't you think? She winced, nodding. I know. But I still want to try. I don't want them to lose, both of us. Rachel, I said, my tone weary, they don't have to lose either of us. This isn't about the kids. This is about us. Or, rather, the end of us. The kids will have both their parents. Just not together. She looked down, swallowing hard. I don't know if I can live like that, she whispered. I don't know if I can handle watching you move on. I shook my head, barely able to process her words. You should have thought of that before, Rachel. You made your choice. You don't get to control how I deal with it now. Her face crumpled, and she looked down, her hands shaking. I don't know what happened to us, Michael, she said quietly. We were supposed to be, forever. That's the thing, Rachel, I said, my voice low and cold. Forever doesn't mean anything when one person isn't willing to be honest. We sat there in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. I could see that she was struggling, that she wanted to say something more, but I wasn't interested in her explanations. I was past caring. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'll sign whatever you need. I'll do whatever it takes to make this as easy as possible. I nodded, my face unreadable. Good. We hammered out a plan over the next hour, agreeing to share custody and divide assets as fairly as possible. There were moments where it was almost civil, where we were just two parents trying to do right by our kids, but the bitterness and resentment hung in the air, a constant reminder of what had happened. We avoided the topic of her betrayal, sticking strictly to practical matters, and that was just fine by me. A week later, the divorce papers were served. Rachel's face went pale as she signed them, her hands trembling, but she didn't say a word. She just signed, closed the folder, and pushed it back across the table toward me. The kids had started to notice the changes by then, the sudden quiet that filled the house, the way their mother's eyes looked red more often than not, the way their dad had stopped calling her honey. They hadn't asked outright yet, but it was only a matter of time. It was 2 weeks later, on a Friday evening, when my oldest, Julia, came up to me as I was putting some dishes away in the kitchen. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and solemn. Dad, are you and Mom okay? I felt a pang in my chest as I looked down at her, her innocent face so full of concern. She was too young to understand what was happening, too young to be burdened with the weight of adult problems, but I knew I couldn't lie to her. We're working through some things, I said gently, keeping my tone as calm as I could. Your mom and I both love you very much, and we're both going to be here for you, no matter what. That's a promise. She nodded, her eyes sad but understanding. Okay, Dad. She wrapped her arms around me, and I held her close, feeling the weight of everything settle over me. I would do whatever it took to protect her from the fallout of this, to make sure she knew that none of this was her fault. The next few months were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and attempts to establish a new routine. Rachel moved into a smaller house nearby, and we agreed on a schedule that would allow the kids to spend time with both of us without disrupting their lives too much. It wasn't easy, but we made it work, for their sake. Rachel tried a few more times to talk to me, to reach out, but I kept my distance. I wasn't interested in rehashing the past, in hearing her apologies. I'd made peace with the fact that our marriage was over, that whatever bond we once shared had been broken beyond repair. There was no going back, and I didn't want to waste any more time dwelling on what might have been. Over time, I found myself letting go of the anger, the bitterness, the need for revenge. It was a gradual process, one that took months, but slowly, I began to feel a sense of peace. I focused on the kids, on rebuilding my life, on finding a way to move forward. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I saw Rachel less and less as time went on, only speaking with her when it was necessary for the kids. She looked different whenever we met, quieter, more subdued. She'd lost that spark, that energy she once had, and I couldn't help but wonder if she regretted her choices, if she lay awake at night thinking about what she'd lost. But I didn't ask. It wasn't my business anymore. One afternoon, nearly a year after the divorce was finalized, I was at the park with the kids, watching them play on the swings and laughing as they raced each other across the playground. A friend of mine, Tom, happened to be passing by, and he stopped to chat. "You look good, Mike," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Better than you did a year ago, that's for sure." I nodded, smiling. "Yeah. I think I'm finally getting the hang of this single dad thing." He laughed. "It suits you. Kids look happy, too. Guess you're doing something right." I looked over at the kids, feeling a sense of pride and contentment that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm trying my best," I said, my voice soft. "That's all I can do." As we talked, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through, the pain, the anger, the betrayal. It had been one of the hardest experiences of my life, but I'd come out the other side stronger, more resilient, more focused on what truly mattered. I'd learned that no matter how deeply someone hurt you, there was always a way to rebuild, to find a new path forward. Rachel and I would never be friends, never be anything more than co-parents trying to give our kids a stable life. But that was enough. I'd let go of the resentment, the need for closure, the endless questions that had once plagued me. I'd found a new kind of peace, a quiet acceptance of what had happened, and a determination to make the most of the life I still had. As the kids came running over, breathless and grinning, I knelt down to hug them, feeling a sense of purpose and fulfillment that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I'd face it with strength, with resilience, with the unwavering love of a father who would do anything for his children. Rachel's betrayal had shattered my world, but I'd rebuilt it, piece by piece. And as I stood there, surrounded by the people who mattered most, I knew that I was exactly where I needed to be.